I'd like to thank you for joining us for Introduction to Supportive Housing, Part 1 of the Permanent Supportive Housing Series. I'd like to quickly introduce today's speakers. Our first speaker is Katie Simons. She is CFO of BeauxSimone Consulting and brings a diverse set of experiences to this work, having worked in K-12 and higher education, the nonprofit and for-profit sectors, and with local and state governments for close to 20 years. Katie brings a deep appreciation for community engagement and inclusiveness when approaching affordable housing and homelessness work. We are also fortunate to be joined today by Laura Rosbert. She's COO at ShopWorks Architecture, where she oversees the internal systems at ShopWorks while also working on affordable housing projects to integrate ideals and values of trauma-informed design. With that said, I will go ahead and turn the webinar controls over to Katie.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you having us, and thank you to all of our guests today for joining us. Thank you to Shantaria for the introductions. This is Katie speaking, and between Laura Rosbert and myself, we will be leading the next hour's worth of discussion on permanent supportive housing to give you really a broad overview of what supportive housing is and what the model is, the guiding principles of housing first and harm reduction. We will also be talking about trauma-informed care and trauma-informed design. And then we will be talking a bit about a couple of case studies, both in a rural community in Neobay, Washington, as well as a slightly more urban community outside of Denver, Colorado, just to really give you a sense of what some of these projects look like. We would welcome you all to please type into the chat box. Would love to know, I do see names of participants here, but would love to know your name and role and organization. As well, if you are able to, just kind of type in a sentence or so about what you're hoping to gain from this training. We certainly hope that we can give you a broad overview of what permanent supportive housing is if you are thinking about doing it in your own community and just want to learn more about what it really takes, and would also love to see if you have some specific hopes that you would like to accomplish in this training today. So that again is just an overview of the agenda, and you know, I am with a consulting company called BeauxSimone Consulting. Laura is with ShopWorks Architecture. We're both based out of Denver, Colorado, but we do work all over the country with tribes, with rural communities, as well as urban communities. We have over 40 years of collective experience for everything from direct service to transitional housing to permanent housing to policy and development work. And we are very excited to be under contract here with Rural Hack in order to do this 3-part webinar series. So we'll just get right into it in terms of what supportive housing is. So some of you maybe have heard of it. Sometimes it's abbreviated as PSH. Sometimes the permanent is left off, and folks just refer to supportive housing as SH. But kind of the fancy definition, if you will, is a cost-effective, outcome-driven, and more humane solution to ending homelessness for families and individuals who struggle with addiction, mental health, and/or other disabilities, who can really benefit and thrive in subsidized housing along with the supportive services. And thank you to everyone who has typed into the chat box to let us know who you are with. Really great to see folks from all over coming forward. Thank you again. So kind of breaking that definition down a little bit further. Again, oftentimes people don't love the term permanent, and so what we like to say is this really is not a time-limited source of housing. So in other words, it's not a shelter, it's not transitional housing. There's not going to be a time limit of, say, 24 months that if a person hasn't, accomplished their goals, that they have to leave. It's not a program. It really is housing that people who are eligible for and who really are a good fit for permanent supportive housing can stay in for as long as they need to. And in some cases that might be, a year and a half to 2 years to really try to stabilize and maybe reunite with family or children or move on to something that is a little bit more independent. And in some cases, say with maybe your Vietnam War era veteran who, is older and disabled and maybe has some mental illness with regards to PTSD or other challenges, they may need to live there for the rest of their lives, and that's okay. The idea really is to not force anyone to stay in permanent supportive housing any longer than they want to, and it's certainly not intended to kick anyone out sooner than they would like to leave. So it really is just non-time limited. It's also affordable, so residents will pay no more than 30% of their income for rent. This type of housing really is targeting the lowest income individuals and families, so people who are earning at or below 30% of the area median income. And so with that said, we know that many folks moving into supportive housing may have no income at all. And that's okay. If they move in with zero income, they will pay zero rent. But one of the goals that care managers and other staff will work on with the residents is increasing their income. And whether that is through employment, if they have the ability to work, or through benefits that they are entitled to, once they are able to have some sort of an income, whether it's $200 a month or $1,200 a month, they will pay 30% of that income towards their rent. And then really the other 70% is going to be subsidized, most likely by some sort of an operating subsidy such as project-based vouchers or HUD-VASH vouchers. And we will certainly get into a bit more about the financing of operations in supportive housing in the next webinar. And then the last thing that we know permanent supportive housing offers is that it really is intended to be as independent as possible. So again, a resident will hold a lease with normal rights and responsibilities and will be expected to adhere to that lease. But really the add-on here is that we know that a lot of folks will not be able to maintain their housing unless they have the supportive services that go along with it. So really, who lives here? Who is permanent supportive housing meant for? It really is meant for families and individuals who are literally homeless, including those who are living on the streets or in shelters. But also in rural communities, we know that homelessness looks very different. So, you know, we may not see visible homelessness as much in rural communities because people are living in overcrowded conditions. They might be in motels. They might be, you know, living with aunts or uncles or families of 8 or 10 or more people, couch surfing, going back and forth between multiple houses. So we do know that, again, rural homelessness and homelessness on reservations and in Indian country really does look different, but we know that this type of housing is intended for those people who are not able to maintain housing on their own and really do need some supportive services to be able to help them get to that point. So many folks as well who might be being discharged from prison, jail, or other systems of care, and people who are really living in, you know, fishing shacks or in trailers without running water or electricity, places that are not meant for human habitation, including cars, is really kind of who this housing is targeting. Again, oftentimes people who live in permanent supportive housing have serious chemical dependency and or mental health issues, and other types of disabilities as well, and again need those supportive services to maintain their stable housing. Some of these folks have burned bridges, right, in other housing or service programs because of big behaviors, we like to call them, not bad behaviors, but big behaviors, we like to call them, that might be associated with substance use disorder or mental health. And again, folks who are costing our communities the most money because they are frequently utilizing emergency services, cycling through, you know, emergency rooms, detox centers, hospitals, jails, prisons, et cetera, because they do not have a stable place to go home to. So what are some of the benefits of supportive housing? You know, we know that this reduces the stress caused by double up and overcrowding, right? So in some unhealthy living situations where, you know, more than 5 people are living in the same house, it really does kind of take off that stress and burden. It also reduces the use of crisis and institutional services that I was mentioning, such as the jail systems, the detox centers, et cetera. This produces better outcomes, right, than more expensive crisis care systems. So we know that it actually is about $15,000 to $20,000 a year less expensive to house someone in subsidized housing with those supportive services than to continue to let them cycle through these emergency services. It significantly reduces recidivism rates, both back into homelessness as well as into the prison system. And for families, it can really end the cycle of homelessness. So we often see family supportive housing in rural communities where we really are trying to ensure that the kids in those families get the education that they need, have their basic health needs met, have their basic nutritional needs met, and are really able to get out of that cycle of poverty and homelessness into a stable living environment, so that ultimately this is hoping to help end and break the cycle of homelessness. So again, just to kind of reiterate what supportive housing is not, it's not a shelter, it's not a group home, right? Not transitional housing or residential care facilities or treatment centers. It really is apartment style living where, again, people have their own leases or are trying to live as independently as possible, but certainly is always associated with and accompanied by staff who are going to be able to offer that high level of support where needed. So a little bit about the service model, if you will, and the guiding principles. We think about kind of the housing intervention or housing model as housing first, and this may be a term that some of you are familiar with. And then really one of the engagement strategies is harm reduction and trauma-informed care, which Laura is going to talk about here in a couple of minutes. So some of you have probably, most of you have maybe seen this this pyramid structure, right? This is the triangle. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So you can read the slide that talks about what housing first is, and essentially it's just that, right? It's giving somebody housing first and foremost, right? Before we think about asking them to do a bunch of things to treat their addiction or to try to recover from trauma or mental health. We know that it's very difficult to treat someone's addiction when they're living under a bridge, right, or cycling through different systems and don't have a steady place to really stabilize and start to heal. So with housing first, if we look at the very basic bottom level of the triangle, it's the physiological needs, right? These are our basic needs of air, food, water, shelter, clothing, and sleep. That we all meet, right? So we know, I know personally, right? I'm not gonna, get up and do my morning yoga and run my 5 miles and do all these things that, give me purpose in life and a healthier life, until I've had a good night's sleep and until I have had some food in my stomach, until I feel safe where I'm living, right? So, so really meeting those very basic needs first, which includes a roof over somebody's head, and really then ensuring that that person starts to feel safe and secure. And again, we'll talk a bit more about this as it relates to trauma and how we do try to help people heal from past traumas through permanent supportive housing. And only then, right, once we have somebody secure and safe, can we really start kind of working up that pyramid towards love and belonging and self-esteem needs and self-actualization. So the housing really provides a foundation, right, from which a person or family can access the services and supports they need to achieve stability and begin the recovery process, as well as pursuing personal goals. So that is a bit about the model under which permanent supportive housing falls. And again, we know that housing really is a basic human right. We know that housing and healthcare are so tightly interwoven, and that we don't always see everyone accessing healthcare and housing on an equal playing level, but that we really do believe that homelessness is a horrible treatment plan, and in order to really start kind of addressing some of those root causes of someone's homelessness and experience with homelessness, we need to be able to provide that basic foundation of housing first. So in this model of housing first, we like to say that people don't necessarily need to be housing ready, right? We are not going to deny housing to someone because they haven't met predetermined clinical goals. As well, we are not going to deny housing to someone if they decide that they don't want to participate in services. So services are voluntary in this model. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. But housing should never be used to coerce somebody into services that they would not otherwise choose, right? So we know that tenant choice, client choice is very important in supportive housing. And as well, that housing and services are interconnected, but there is separate criteria, right, for the operation and evaluation of the housing, as well as for the services that someone might choose to engage in. But again, this is really just to say, we're not going to expect somebody to be sober before they move into housing. We're not going to say you have to be compliant with your medications, right? You have to receive treatment for your mental health. If at some point, that is on someone's goal, that is part of someone's goal towards their healing path, towards their recovery path, the staff at these buildings will do everything that they can to engage participants and to engage residents in meeting their goals. And so whatever that means in terms of offering services, those will always be there. But the main thing to remember here is that is client-driven, and that really is something that we want to, as professional staff, take the lead from our residents. So again, it's about self-determination, right? It's about figuring out what it is that somebody who lives in supportive housing really wants, and what do they determine for themselves is going to be the best. It might not always be the best thing that the case manager thinks is the best thing for the person. But again, this is not about dictating to residents what they need to do. It's really about finding and encouraging that self-determination. We do this through harm reduction and recovery. We do this through client-driven supports, and certainly through social integration and community building. Being really one of the most important aspects of any supportive housing building is to be able to offer community engagement, community building activities, and really an opportunity for folks to feel safe within their community, that they belong, and that they really are at home. So again, while services are not mandatory, we like to say they're voluntary for the residents, they're not voluntary for the staff, right? So we want to make sure that we have really dedicated peer navigators and specialists and care managers and clinicians and whomever else you are going to have as part of your staffing plan in one of these buildings, that they are there to do everything possible, right? That they are going to be providing services targeted based on the population, right? So a population of veterans, for example, might have very different needs than a population of youth or a population of families, for example. So these services are really going to be targeted towards the population that is living in the building. We don't want to put people into a supportive housing building who really can't benefit from the services that are offered there. As well, we want the services to be very flexible. So we want to make sure that we're responding to comprehensive resident needs and not just kind of being short-sighted about the first thing that we think somebody is wanting to engage in. Voluntary, again, as I've said before, participation not being a condition of residency or of keeping housing. And independent, so that we focus specifically on housing stability and doing everything and anything we can do to engage residents to make sure that they are safe and that they are thriving and that they are able to maintain their housing. Again, some keys to services working really well, right? They've got to be comprehensive, they've got to be culturally relevant, and they have to be tenant-driven, right? I think I've reiterated that now a number of times. Effective, creative engagement strategies, making sure that you have the right staff and supervision in place, linking services, right, to partners from the community, so being able to offer a wide variety of services both on-site at a building as well as where can we connect, right, with mental health providers or with family services or with employment and job training, vocational services. If those can't be offered directly within the building, we want to make sure that we're making those community connections and those service linkages within the community. And then really, we'll talk a little bit as well, maybe more about this in the second and third webinar, but that collaborative relationship with property management, right? So, so in this model, and I think Laura has a nice visual of this a little bit later on, but we really do have three kind of separate arms here. We have a development side, we have an operations and management side, and we have a services side. We'll talk a bit more about all those different budgets and financing for each of the three parts of the stool, if you will. But we do know that it really is crucial to have strong working relationships between your frontline staff, who are going to be, again, your front desk staff and your care managers or case managers, as well as your property managers and maintenance technicians, right? That everybody in this building is working together. While property management may certainly have different goals that they have to meet than services, we want to make sure that together they are working to really benefit the residents who live there and making sure that they are doing things through a trauma-informed and harm reduction approach that gives residents the best chance to succeed in this housing. So again, a couple of examples of services, counseling, which would include, health and mental health, therapeutic counseling, alcohol and substance use services, independent living skills. So a lot of folks, again, who maybe have just been coming off of the streets or been in shelters for a long time, may need very basic independent living skills, right? Assistance with housekeeping and assistance with nutrition and assistance with cooking and taking care of an apartment, things like that. So those are certainly things that care managers can assist with. Money management and budgeting, right? So if somebody is now expected to pay 30% of their income towards rent, how do we ensure that they can do that in a timely fashion and that they really are able to manage their money? Again, community building activities, this could be anything from bingo nights to barbecues to, having folks come down for morning bagels in the lobby and community room, employment training, job placement, mentoring, benefits acquisition, and children and family services. Again, this is just an example of some of the services. You can be as creative as you possibly can be with the offerings that you're able to offer in one of these buildings. Again, just individualized. We want to make sure that individuals are involved in the design, the development, and the implementation of their plan, right? So again, we may have an individualized service plan for residents, but this is something that the tenant designs with a case manager. This is a strengths-based approach to goal setting. We use motivational interviewing quite a bit, which is something that we can get into later as well with regards to engaging residents and meeting goals that they're really motivated to meet. So whether that's reconnecting with a daughter, for example, that they haven't seen in 20 years, or getting a driver's license. Maybe simple things that we think of that a tenant might want to do before they think about addressing anything else that might feel much bigger picture to us. Assessments and service plans are updated regularly, and we're constantly having those care managers check in with residents. Again, just some other examples of staff that you might see, residential counselors, front desk managers, care managers, therapists, your leasing agent, obviously your property managers and maintenance techs on the property management side of things. All right, so I know that was a lot. I am going to take a break from talking and turn it over to Laura, who is now going to speak a little bit more about harm reduction, as well as trauma-informed care and trauma-informed design in supported housing.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Katie, and so good to be with all of you today. Just to give a little bit more, I realized in my bio I didn't actually share the fact that until 18 months ago, I've always been in the nonprofit world, and my most recent role was at the Dolores Project, which is a homeless shelter for women and transgender individuals here in Denver, and I oversaw the development of 130 units of affordable housing and a brand new homeless shelter from the ground up. So I oversaw 35 units of supportive housing, and then another nonprofit we worked with oversaw 95 units of workforce housing. And so in my role at Dolores, I implemented a lot of the best practices here, trauma-informed care and harm reduction and other things. So just sharing that, I'm not talking about anything that I haven't kind of struggled with and been on my own journey. So I'm super excited for questions you all might have because I know some of the things that we'll share about really kind of flip things on their head based on what folks are used to hearing about. So housing first, harm reduction really piggybacks with housing first. Because if you have folks who have no preconditions for coming into housing, you're going to, kind of get the gamut of what folks are struggling with and what coping mechanisms they've chosen to be able to survive, right? And the goal of all of these programs is that folks kind of come into supportive housing surviving, and we get to them to the place where they can thrive because they're empowered over their own lives in ways they haven't been for years and years. So as we think about harm reduction, it's really acknowledging that there are none of those preconditions, right, to coming in. So right at Dolores, I don't expect people having a hard go at life to make what we consider perfect choices, right? They're trying to survive. Condemning people doesn't work or encourage them to change their behaviors, right? We're all adults, we're humans, we're making our own life choices. And the whole goal of supportive housing is you're creating an environment where folks know where they're going to sleep every night, where they have a key to a room that they know is safe, that then maybe they're going to choose to make choices that better help them move towards stability. And so as it relates to harm reduction, the idea is that, you know, folks, I mean, I don't know about your group of friends, right, but drinking and use of illicit chemicals is a part of our society. And it is not fair to declare that certain people aren't allowed to be a part of that just because of their economic level. And so given the fact that certain things are a part of our society and aren't going away, the goal is to minimize the harmful effects rather than just strict condemnation, right? At Dolores, I ran a wet shelter. Folks could come in, and if they had been drinking, they didn't lose their bed, right? And that allowed them to know that they had a bed night after night after night. And it's from that then folks can make potentially different choices. Or just know that they're going to drink to the point that they don't get kicked out of the shelter because they're no longer safe and have to go to detox. And so it's really about keeping people safe before we're judging their decisions. Harm reduction is something we do all the time in regular life. In a global pandemic that we're a part of right now, this is, you know, for me and my partner every day, it's a conversation about harm reduction around COVID, right? What choices are we making? COVID is out there, but, you know, we stayed at home for a very long time, and, you know, then somebody had to go get groceries, right? And so as we think about harm reduction, it's acknowledging, you know, my dad's an actuary, right? Getting in a car is a dangerous prospect, but we do things like seatbelts and safety ratings and things of that nature to make it more safe to drive, but it's not perfectly safe, right? And so how do we, you know, harm reduction is something that we're super comfortable with in general, and so it's about kind of thinking about that as we look at supportive housing. So really the thing is harm reduction is all about allowing people to make their own choices, because human beings want to be empowered over their own lives. And they are the only people who, I am the only person who has authority over my life and what choices I make and what path I go down. And I think, you know, this doesn't mean that folks can beat up other people or do things that literally are unsafe, but it's about thinking, when am I creating a rule because it's uncomfortable, and when am I creating rules because it's unsafe? In the homeless shelter, we did a whole overview and rehaul of our rules to implement harm reduction and trauma-informed care, which I'll get to next. And it really shifted a lot of our rules. We went from like 4 pages of like size 10 font rules to a single 1-page matrix. Because no, this is about keeping people safe, keeping the individual and the community safe, and then these are the rules that should apply. And really, you know, harm reduction really requires a deep understanding of how trauma has impacted folks' brains and thus how they act. And so I could geek out over this for like hours and hours, and I'm going to take about 10 minutes to talk about trauma-informed care and trauma-informed design. But please know I'm open to kind of any other questions you all might have. So when we look at trauma, what I really focus on is there was this study called the ACE study done between the CDC and Kaiser Permanente in 1995 looking at a middle-class suburb in California. And when you, what they did is, so your ACE score is an adverse childhood experience. And what they saw is it's a simple rating from 0 to 10 that really looks at a variety of experiences. And these are things from really kind of abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction, including divorce, mental illness, or things of that nature. And so what they did is they simply, at the count, 0 to 10, depending on what experiences you've had, and And they found that there were all of these connections between what somebody's ACE score was and health outcomes. So for example, if you had an ACE score of 2 or more, you're 4 times more likely to label yourself as an alcoholic, or you're 3 times more likely to have attempted suicide. People with ACE scores of 6 or more died 20 years earlier on average than those without ACEs. And the thing that was shocking to me when I geeked out over this research is that this is about behaviors that maybe we'd think about, right? Alcoholism, right? Depression, as I named. But it's also about things like people having a higher rate of broken bones or heart disease or cancer. And so there's a lot of scientists who ask why. And Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, she has an incredible TED Talk that I'll put in the chat at the end, really about, this is about the impact that stress has on our body. And she talks about, fight or flight is a gift to us, right? It keeps us safe when we're in the woods and we encounter a bear. But what happens to our bodies when that bear comes home every single night? And so what we find in the research is that trauma literally rewires your brain. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex that is required for impulse control and executive functioning. It shifts the pleasure and reward center of the brain, which is why we see those deep impacts in substance abuse. And it also shifts the amygdala, the fear response center. So even if you don't engage in high-risk behavior as the result of your trauma, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. And so it also keeps people constantly in fight or flight. So it goes from being this adaptive behavior to being very, very damaging. And so what we see when, how do we respond to this, right? I mean, for me, the example that always makes the easiest sense is, if I as a kid lived in a house where there was some abuse, there was some substance use, and every time I went to an authority figure to get some help with something, they denied my request for help. Well, my brain is going to wire itself to not trust authority and to realize that authority is bad and they're not going to help me thrive. And so then these individuals are more likely to end up experiencing homelessness because of these childhood traumas. And then they walk into my shelter and they're not being nice to my staff, and they're really fighting against them. And it's really hard because this person is making really terrible choices and being kind of rude to my staff. But when you listen to what happened to them, you realize they're fighting authority because authority has never been worthy of their trust. And so it's the responsibility of organizations to really shift this and offer these principles of trauma-informed care so that folks can maybe work to start rewiring their brain. But again, just like harm reduction, we can't expect people to be perfect when life has dealt them a really rough deck of cards. And so it's the responsibility of those who have power, those who are building housing and those who are running programs, to really commit themselves to really prioritizing safety and peer support, letting them lean on one another, because sometimes those relationships feel safer. Giving folks say, when we redesigned our shelter rules, the guests sat at the table to redesign those with us. Because at the end of the day, I wasn't going to have to live by those rules. I was going to go home to my house every night. And when folks are a part of the creation of rules, then they're going to be on board with them, right? You also have to be very mindful of kind of cultural, historical, and gender issues. How are systems of inequality playing out in this space and impacting those rules? And for example, maybe who has to follow the rules and who's given some passes against them. And so, and SAMHSA has incredible help and assistance as you really think about this trauma-informed approach. And so again, I mean, the idea of being a trauma-informed organization should impact every single piece of an organization, from boards of directors to staff to volunteers to the guests and clients themselves. By really acknowledging the deep impact trauma has that shifts people's bodies so they're sitting there in fight or flight, even though they'd love to just be able to take a deep breath and relax. Their body is not letting them. And so we cannot expect them to act in a certain way when their body won't let them. You know, that's not fair, as my 8-year-old would say. So for me, you know, my thoughts around trauma-informed care is it's constantly seeking to understand and not to judge. It's not yelling at people like, why are you doing this, right? I mean, but why are you responding in this way? You know, and the example I'll give before I run into trauma-informed design, which I've got a couple slides on, is at the Dolores Project, there was this woman who, for months and months and months, slept in a tent catty-corner to our shelter. And we had staff after staff after staff go out to her and say, come in, we can give you a warm meal, we can give you a really nice bed. What do you need? We'd love to be there for you. And she was like, no, I'm good. I got this tent, I'm good. And finally somebody went out and shared a little bit about themselves and invited her to share her story. It ends up her entire family died in a house fire. And since then, she had chosen to be homeless because inside was not safe. And we took a minute to get to know her, and finally by that, we were able to offer her the bed by the emergency exit, and then she was willing to come into the shelter. But if we just sat there and judging her for choosing that tent outside instead of this warm place, we're not getting to know her, and we're not helping her. But her past trauma caused her to make really smart decisions for her that from an outside observer, we could so easily judge, right? So as Katie mentioned, so when I was at the Dolores Project and we were building Arroyo Village, I was implementing trauma-informed care in the shelter while we were designing the building. And what ended up happening is we brought our architecture team, ShopWorks, where I now work, into one of these trainings we got from SAMHSA. And it blew the architects' minds. And this is a firm that does nonprofits and homeless shelters and supportive housing and affordable housing. And the architect Chad was like, wow, I've been trained to design buildings. I need to design spaces mindful of mental health. And so as you're working on dreaming about or pondering the thought of supportive housing, it's really important that both kind of the services that are going to be provided are trauma-informed and following housing first, but property management as well, but also the building. Buildings matter, right? And so it's really important to think about how to design with trauma and all these best practices in mind. And when we were designing Arroyo Village, you know, we went for research to say, what does this look like? And we could find information on what it meant for hospitals and, you know, what it meant for certain areas, but not housing. And so one of the first things I did in my new gig was do a research project where we went and interviewed folks living in supportive housing and residents to hear what helps them heal and what spaces help them heal. And so, you know, trauma-informed design acknowledges, you know, I am an utter optimist. And so for folks who've experienced trauma, you know, my thought at every juncture is, what's the road to healing and recovery look like for somebody? What does it look like for them to build on all the resiliency they've had to build over their lives, and let that be finally in a safe environment that just wants them to thrive? And so it means that in the design of the building, you really need to think about how mental health has folks experience things differently. There's this great research by this Professor Jan Stepp, who noted that they put a tuft of cat hair in a mouse's cage, and the mouse cowered in the corner. And to me, it's the perfect example, right? The cat hair could not hurt those mice, but they had a fight or flight response to it. So when we're designing buildings, what does it mean to make sure that we're not putting cat hairs throughout the space? I'm going to take about 3 more minutes before we move into our case study. But this is the framework that we came up with, and we have a research paper that includes a lot of pretty examples, so I'd love to share that with you at the end of this as well. But the trauma-informed design framework really notes when we're designing affordable housing and supportive housing, and frankly, as it relates to ACE scores, 64% of Americans have an ACE score of at least 1. So when we're designing for trauma, we're designing for all of us. It's not designing for those people over there, right? So at the heart of this is really the idea of comfort, community, and choice. And comfort is both what allows people to relax, but also what brings people joy. How do we bring in natural elements that there's a lot of research in biophilia that really allows people to heal? It's also really thinking about kind of sound and smell and how noise travels through a building, because for folks who've been experiencing homelessness and come inside and are trying to work on their own healing, that's really important. Community is the heart and soul of trauma-informed care and trauma-informed design. The way that we heal is by building trusting relationships, both with fellow residents and with staff. And the surrounding neighborhood. So how are we designing for community? You know, one of the greatest things we learned is amenity space needs to be near staff offices for both of those systems to work well together. You know, it's also about laundry. I mean, for folks who've experienced homelessness, I mean, laundry can be very triggering to put all of your worldly possessions in a machine and walk away if they're unwilling. So at ShopWorks, we've shifted to doing laundry spas so that folks can sit and read a book and sit in the living room while their laundry's happening in the same room, and they never have to leave it, right? And then it's also about choice. Empowerment is important. It can be as simple as dimmer switches and blackout blinds. Or how are we designing different colors on different floors so that folks, when they're choosing their apartment, feel like they get to have a choice in this beautiful apartment that somebody has built for them. And then it's about really acknowledging these core values of really thinking about how we're creating connection and hope and empowerment. Safety is both real and perceived. In our buildings, with our commitment to trauma-informed design, we interview potential residents to hear what feels safe to them, what feels hopeful to them. It's about not making those assumptions, you know. And then it's really acknowledging the context around. You know, what's the neighborhood it's in? What cultures will people be bringing into this building? What are the lived experiences of folks here that we need to be mindful of? What is, you know, at Dolores Shelter, we served a high population of trans folks, both trans men and women. And bathrooms are a really scary place for trans folks. So we spent great money and great space to create the most beautiful bathroom. And I'll tell you, when I walk in there now, people literally hang out in the bathroom because it's so beautiful, right? So this place that has been harmful in people's life is now a source of community and relationship. So for me, Maslow, bringing it back up, right? Trauma-informed design, architects and developers are often designed to work on these kind of physiological needs and safety needs at the bottom rung here. About creating units, it's a gift, and that's great. But how do we make sure that we're not just creating units, but we're creating places of love and belonging where folks are empowered to have a say over the space around them and the rules there as well. And then here are just a couple examples. I'll send the research paper that has a lot more examples that really explains this more than any words I say could. But this is, for example, the entrance to the Dolores Project shelter. You know, it's not what you think of when you think of a homeless shelter, but there's rocking chairs for folks to sell food. There's a great courtyard to the right in this picture so folks can come inside and immediately go outside. You know, it's bringing in those natural calming elements and those spaces really for connection, coming together around a table. So now I'm going to hand it back off to Katie to share some case studies.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Laura. I just get so inspired every time I hear you talk about this stuff, so really appreciate it. And you know, now that we've given you a little bit of, again, just kind of the what is permanent supportive housing and the why behind it, we wanted to share a couple of examples with you of some great projects that have come about here within the last year to 5 years or so, and just really kind of bring these to life. We have about 15 minutes left, and I definitely want to leave some time for questions and comments here at the end. So if you do have questions, please start typing those into the Q&A box, and I'll get through these case studies in the next couple of minutes, and then hopefully have the last 5 or 10 minutes or so for questions and discussion. So just a couple of examples. Wanted to show you first the Makah Permanent Supportive Housing, which is up on the Makah Reservation in Neah Bay, Washington. This is the front entrance of the building. And so, you know, oftentimes when we're working in rural communities or with American Indian communities, you know, they don't want to see, and they're not used to having as housing, you know, a big, you know, 50-unit apartment building that is 3 stories or 5 stories in the air. Oftentimes they really actually look to townhomes or individual, maybe even modular homes, you know, family space, certainly folks who are accustomed to living with family, relatives, friends, want to have a bigger space, but one that they can call their own. And so what we wanted to make sure, you know, happened with the sale River Longhouse was that there was a front door entrance that, again, is secure and safe. As Laura mentioned in the trauma-informed design piece, we actually do want to make sure, and this is now best practice with permanent supportive housing, to have a secure front door entrance, which means that there really is one way for folks to come into the building, and once they come into the building, there is a monitored 24-hour, 7-day-a-week front desk. And this is really a welcome desk. This is a sort of a trauma-informed care concierge desk, if you will. That there's somebody there who is welcoming residents, welcoming them home, talking to guests or visitors or vendors who come into the building, really sort of just helping to direct people. But it's that friendly, welcoming, warm person who can, you know, sometimes we say it's the grandma, right, who everybody both respects and is afraid of, right? And so they're going to be held accountable if they're doing something that's, you know, not really great, maybe sneaking somebody in who shouldn't be there, or, you know, doing something that front desk person can really say, hey, you know, that might not be a good idea, but we're also making sure that front desk person is keeping the residents in the building safe. So if, for example, there are times in which a resident doesn't want to have a visitor, you know, it can be really hard for them to say to Joe, who maybe they crashed on Joe's couch for a bit and when they were experiencing homelessness, and now Joe is really having a hard time and he wants to come into the apartment. Well, instead of having the resident have to do that and make that hard decision to say no, because they're really not going to be able to do that, they may not be able to do that, we can have a front desk staff do that for them. So long and short way of saying, we want to have a safe and secure front door entrance, which you can kind of see here on the left-hand side. In this picture, the series of 3 pictures, and then it really opens up into this welcome area, right? So there's a place with fire, there's a seating area right off to the left there, our offices to the right, there's a big community room. So that is a really great approach in terms of having this lobby space. It's trauma-informed, there is staff available, and people can kind of come in before they actually then enter out into this open courtyard. So they were able to really design this in a way where they're both able to have secure entrances into their own individual apartments, but also, as you can see, there are balconies which allow parents, for example, to look out onto the courtyard where their kids might be playing. So again, this is a supportive housing project that serves formerly homeless Makah Tribal members and their families, many of whom have disabilities and would not be able to maintain their housing without the services provided. 21 units. This opened in 2014, and my colleague Zoe LeBeau consulted on this for many years with the Makah Housing Authority to get this done. But this is really the result, right, of what that open, trauma-informed courtyard looks like. Very culturally relevant, so they're having, you know, a dance, and people are able to come and sit, as well as if you can see on the balconies there in the upper kind of left side of the picture, you know, you've got families who can then come out and from their own balconies, their own front door to their apartments, can watch what's happening in that courtyard. So it's a really amazing space that was built both to promote community and community building, but as well to be able to kind of provide that privacy and that security so that folks do have that front door entrance before they come into that lobby and then out into this courtyard, which then takes them into their own apartments. So that's a really great example. Beautiful, beautiful building if you ever have the opportunity to get up there to kind of the most northwestern point, if you will, of Washington. So Makah and then Providence at the Heights is the other example that we want to share with you. We call this PATH for short. And this is a building that was developed by Blue Line Development, and Shopworks was actually the architect on it. This is a great nighttime picture that was taken during a thunderstorm in Aurora, Colorado. And just a beautiful building that's actually opened earlier this year in February of 2020. It's 50 total units, 41 bedrooms, 10 two-bedrooms. And this really is serving people who are formerly homeless and people who would be in need of services due to past criminal justice involvement. So we really targeted in this building folks who were reentering, and in Colorado we have a very, very high recidivism rate, about 49% going back to prison. And the lead service provider on this project is a group called Second Chance Center. Before they even had housing, they were working with a recidivism rate of about 10%. So well below the national and state average in Colorado. And obviously one of the biggest barriers that they found for folks who formerly incarcerated is, barriers to getting housing and barriers to getting employment. So they decided to team up with Blue Line and to build this beautiful building. And people are really, starting to get settled in. Obviously, it was a blessing and a curse, right, to be able in the last week of February, 1st of March, to be able to move folks in off the streets, freezing cold temperatures, and into housing. And then 6 weeks later, or 4 weeks later, COVID hit. And so that really put things into perspective, right, in terms of what we were trying to do with regards to community building and social integration within a building with 50 households, 62 people total, including kids. Really difficult to try to figure out how do we keep people safe, and again, try to help people from self-isolating, because that's the last thing we want folks to do in one of these buildings. But anyway, they've done a great job in getting creative with social distancing. Fortunately, there's been no positive cases in that building. And it really is just, again, through the trauma-informed design, but also spatial awareness, I would say, in this building has allowed for folks to be able to live safely and in spaces that keep them away from other folks who, during a global pandemic, might put them at risk. So anyway, this is just a couple of pictures of the indoor sort of lobby area, as well as a community room and kitchen space. And then a picture of the outside as well, showing the building from a different angle with the landscaping. So just a little bit again about the why supportive housing. Misty is a resident at Providence at the Heights. She's 34 years old, and her son, who is 3, were homeless, and they were rotating between living on the streets and staying at the Samaritan House, which is a family shelter in Denver. She had lost custody of her son for a short time due to their homelessness, and she was not able to keep him safe. And so once she received a call that she had been selected for Providence at the Heights and she was eligible, she worked with Child Protective Services to make sure that she could keep her son. And they have since closed her case, so she has been able to reunite. She's been able to really find that familiar support that she has needed. There are family services that continue to be offered at the building. And with a stable home, Misty is now looking for a job and some additional child care for her son. But it really is just a wonderful example of what supportive housing is able to do for folks. This is, again, national best practice, evidence-based. We see retention rates of 80 to 85% of housing stability for folks who move in and stay after 1 year. And really, as Laura mentioned, not just survive, right, in this type of housing environment, but really thrive and really are able to start down their path of healing and of recovery, and of getting back into community and getting back to the type of lives that people really are wanting to live. So that is the end of our case studies, and we've definitely provided a little bit of time here, only 5 minutes, but a bit of time for questions and comments. And we've also provided our contact information here on the last slide, which will be shared. I know that Laura is going to share the Nadine Burke TED Talk information in the chat box, and any other questions or comments that we can try to address here in the next 5 minutes, we would love to hear from you.
All right. Thank you so much, Katie and Laura. Really appreciate all of that information. Such a wonderful case study about Misty and looking at the impacts of what permanent supportive housing can do. Wanted to really go ahead and throw to one question. We had a question that came into the chat function earlier from Lisa out at Opal Land Trust. And what she wanted to know was, is it possible to provide permanent supportive housing on a small scale, say 5 or 10 homes in a rural setting? They have chronically homelessness individuals with PTSD and addiction issues, and they want quiet and often just stay in the woods.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa, for that question. We'd love to chat further and kind of brainstorm with you. Yes, it is possible. What I will say is, every supportive housing building is different, and every financing structure for that building, it can also be different. And so in a small rural community, looking at 5 to 10 units, probably not big enough for, say, a low-income housing tax credit development, which usually wants to see about, at least a minimum of 30 units to kind of start down that path. But there are other ways, and we are actually piloting a small 13-unit project in rural southeast Colorado in Lamar, which is going to use modular units to create a supportive housing community. So modular, again, is, I think, a great option that is certainly less expensive than your traditional stick build, as well as much more efficient in terms of production. And so I think, looking at taking old or new shipping containers, turning them into well-built, well-designed, sustainable, healthy, dignified units, anything can be done in terms of, designing a trauma-informed building, and it can certainly be done in smaller communities where you're just looking to do a couple of units. The financing will be tricky. I'll just put that out there first, but not impossible, and there are certainly other sources, through Federal Home Loan Bank, state housing trust funds, HUD, whether you're looking at, if doing so on a reservation, might be able to take advantage of some of the HUD or Title VI funding that's available. In rural communities, might be able to look at some other local or state funds in your own community that might be available. So happy to help kind of think through any of that with you, and encourage you to take a look at some of the modular companies that are really working right now to get some of these units into production much more efficiently and faster.
Thank you, Katie. We will be sharing the information from Laura, the TED Talk link, as well as the link to ShopWorks, as well as the presentation following the broadcast. And so those of you that have asked that question in the Q&A box, be on the lookout for the link, or visit HAC's website for that information. There's also another question here, Katie, for you. Janet from out at Monroe Housing wants to know, is the property you discussed 100% permanent supportive housing unit?
Yes, Janet, in both cases, both Makah as well as in Aurora, Colorado, so River Longhouse as well as Providence at the Heights, both are 100% permanent supportive housing. And again, I'll just mention you can do both, right? You can do a 100% permanent supportive housing, or you can do a mixed income, mixed build. So again, lots to figure out with regards to the financing, both building it as well as operating it, but it is possible to do a mix of permanent supportive housing and non-permanent supportive housing, but still low-income units within the same building.
Right. Thanks for that answer. We have another couple of minutes. We are right at the top of the hour, and I do not see a last and final question in the chat box, but what I will say is that there is part 2 and 3 coming up, so please be on the lookout. Right after we conclude here today, you will receive an email which gives you a link to the evaluation for the webinar. Please take a moment to fill that evaluation out. You will also be redirected to HAC's website, where you can find additional information on the upcoming webinar. Both Katie and Laura's information is listed here on the screen. And so with no final questions, I'm trying to allow folks another minute or so to type in any questions that you might have in the Q&A box. But if any are received, we will forward those along to both Katie and Laura. Wanted to take this last opportunity or this last moment here in the session today to offer a huge thanks to both Katie and Laura for the wealth of information that they've shared, as well as to each of you for your time and participation during today's webinar. Again, as we close, please be on the lookout for a survey following the webinar. We ask that you take a moment to fill it out. That is the way that you tell us if we're bringing the most relevant content to you based upon your programs and services. And so with that said, thank you again and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.